This talk should have been given in the spring, but due to COVID-19, we're giving the same talk is going to be given now. And it was to remind us of what we all did over the last 20 years, you may say, to get Atlas 2020 done, like Brexit. So the question to be answered, how did we do it in Ireland? And just at the beginning, I'd like to thank people for photographs, Rory Hod, Maria Long, Hannah Northridge, National Museums of Northern Ireland, and there's possibly some other, I may have used a slide of somebody's that I have forgotten to credit. Now, prior to 2017, each Vice County Recorder worked on their own, in their own Vice County, many of us doing an excellent job in getting high coverage. But nobody had thought of looking at what was happening across the whole of Ireland. And this was done by in January 2017 by the Committee for Ireland, who used the DDB to analyse the Irish data and see what we needed to do in the next 3 years to have good coverage by the end of Atlas 2020. Now, initially we set a target we would try to get 200 species in all the 1,008 hectads in Ireland. And where did the 200 species per hectare come from? Well, the previous year I had taken on County Cavan, and I'd found that if Hannah and I spent a day in a hectare in Cavan, we could almost certainly always get somewhere in excess of 200 species. So we thought that if a botanist or two spent a day in every hectare in Ireland, 200 species should be achievable. Obviously, 200 species in one hectare is a lot easier to find than in some others. So later, we redefined a second target, which was to try to re-find 60% of all the species that had ever been found in that hectare. Now, here are two maps which we've seen versions of before. The left-hand one shows a map of Ireland in January 2017, and it shows the number of species per hectare post 2000. The white squares have less than 200 species, and the red squares have a very high number, 500, 600, 700. So one can see that for various reasons, there were large areas of Ireland that needed further coverage, or there was data that needed to be entered into the DDB. And it's hard to say what was exactly needed in each area. So that's the situation in January 2017. And the right-hand picture map of Ireland shows the coverage 3 years later on New Year's Eve 2020, when Atlas officially closed. And you will see that all the white squares have become blue, and the light blue squares have become darker blue, and there are quite a few more red squares. So that was, in numbers, that was what we did over the 3 years. This screen consists actually of two tables, one on the left-hand side and one on the right-hand side. The left-hand side shows what was achieved by the end of Atlas 2020. The number of species per hectare could be 800 plus, 700 plus, going down to 100 plus. Now, at the end of the Atlas period, there were 7 hectares in which we had found over 800 species post 2000. If you go down the columns, in 20 hectares, there were over 700 species. And if we go down to the critical original number, there were over 200 species in 972 of the 1,008 hectares. Many of the remaining hectares consisted largely of the sea or something, and so there would never be 200 species in them. On the other criterion that we were working on, which was the percentage refines, we said that 60% we hoped would be a good target to aim for. And if you look at just to the middle of the right-hand table, you will see that we had over 60% in 1,003 of the 1,008 hectares. If you up the table, there was 80% refined rate in 468, which is nearly 500 or half the hectares. Incredibly, at the top of the column, there were 5 hectares in which we had 100% refined rate. one might like to sort of think how in actual fact does one achieve that? So the question is, how was this achieved? And I think the starting point is that it could not have been achieved without the huge amount that was put in by the 40 Vice-County recorders in Ireland. Here are 3 of them. Luckily, they're all heavily disguised in their hats, and we can't see their faces, so I'm not going to tell you who they are, but they seem to be having some difficulty identifying something, judging by the number of books they have out. So thank you to all the Vice-County recorders for the huge amount of effort that was put in over the last 20 years. When the Committee for Ireland was looking at how we might get good coverage in the areas which were under-recorded, we took a leaf out of something that Maria had started the previous year, which was a long 4 to 5 day meeting in an interesting out-of-the-way place. Maria held the first one in Mayo, and here are some pictures from it. Mayo is an amazingly huge, large county with lots of habitats. So they were out on the sea coast in the left-hand one. I think they're on the edge of an urban lake in the middle one. And every evening, Maria and I see Rory sitting there, every evening was spent learning and identifying specimens from the day. So the Committee for Ireland took a leaf out of the book of long 4 to 5 day meetings, and the next year organised one in Kerry, one of the most spectacular counties in Ireland. Luckily, for much of the 5 days, there was a lot of sunshine, as we can see in the left-hand picture, but I'm afraid there was also the usual rains for which Kerry, with the highest rainfall in Ireland, is famous. In the middle picture, I see 3 ladies, one of whom I know quite well, sheltering behind some rocks, trying to eat their picnic, with a big waterfall cascading down behind them. In the right-hand picture, Rory is leading a group up Brandon. With the mist prevented us getting to the top, but we found some amazing plants on the way up. So 2017 was Kerry. The next year we headed to Clare Island, which of course is famous for the Clare Island survey, and we stayed in the village at the left-hand end of the island where Praeger and his group had stayed all those years ago. It's a beautiful place to explore, and I think the people on the right-hand picture must have had some premonition of what was to come several years down the line, because they all seem to be social distancing for some reason along the edge of this upland lake. So that was Clare Island. On Clare Island, I think holly fern was found for the first time in 100 years or something like that. Last year was 2019, we went to Connemara, a very exciting place with many interesting species. And one of the things that happened over the 3 or 4 years of those 4 and 5 day field meetings was the number of people who came from England to join us. And they certainly brought a lot of expertise to us natives of the country, and brought a different experience of botany, and as well as us teaching them things about specialities of the west of Ireland. The 4 and 5 day field trips were a major part of the activity, but in the old days, most field trips were a 1 day affair. But over the last while, most trips became 2 day affairs, and they were held all over the country. These pictures were taken in Donegal. The left-hand one is obviously on a beach, and the right-hand one, I think that's me waving in the distance, and I'm marking the end point of oyster plant, Mertensia, growing along this shingle beach on Inishowen. And it was 100 meters of it along the shore. I'd never seen anything like it. So we organized these 1 and 2 day field trips to places which were under-recorded, and many exciting finds were made during those field trips. People undertook to be what they called roving recorders, and they headed out, they got some information on where there was a hectad that needed further records, and they headed off there and spent a day. This is 2 botanists trying to find some interesting aquatics. And on the right-hand picture, there is what is quite unusual to see a bladderwort in flower, and this was in County Westmeath. And the shape of the flowers told us that it was Utricularia vulgaris SS. So that's the only time I've seen it in flower. So the roving recorders did a very good job in mopping up occasional squares. And this map shows activities of the roving recorder extraordinaire, namely Paul Green. All the hectads marked green have been visited by Paul since 2000. He has visited over 600 of the 1,008 hectads, more than half of them. In 5 of these hectads, he has found over 800 species. He has, in 1 year, 2019, Paul input over 90,000 records to the DDB, which I was astonished to see was more than the next 8 recorders put together. The next 8 people had about 10,000 each. So their totals only came to 80,000, but Paul exceeded the efforts of all 8 of us. And Paul O'Mara also put in 90,000 records in 1 year. It's worth saying that with all this travel from, you can see Inishowen down here and West Cork down the other end of the country, some of Paul's expenses were covered by the Wildflower Society, and we're very grateful to them for that. The rough crew made a huge contribution to Atlas 2020. They traveled to places that others of us could never reach, islands, mountaintops, gorges, and this is Brandon on the left, I think again. I've forgotten where the middle picture is. And the right-hand picture is a sort of small rough crew trip that John Faulkner and I organised to Inishtrahull, the most northerly point of Ireland, which is in a hectad by itself and hadn't been visited for 40 or so years. So we got on a boat out there, and this is John looking for and finding Ophioglossum azoricum that was found there during the war. At the western end, you can see the lighthouse on the horizon. So the rough crew did a huge amount towards the project. We were very lucky to get funding from the National Parks and Wildlife Service and also CEDAR to run workshops in difficult groups. And there were 2 two-day charophyte workshops in the Midlands in 2018, with Nick Stewart and Killian Roden being the tutors. In the left-hand pictures, there was a lot of indoor work with microscopes. There were people out of doors learning the field characteristics of these charophytes and being sent into the lake to get their feet wet to actually find them. There was also, as part of this project, there was also a workshop by Linda Weeks. These 2 maps are quite interesting. They are, if you look at the top of the map, the left-hand one covers 3 years, 2014, 15, 16, and the right-hand one, the next 3 years, 2017, 18, 19. And it is all the hectads that had charophyte records during that 3-year period. So there's a certain number here in the first 3-year period, but look, there's 3 times as many in the second 3-year period. So that was due to the encouragement by Nick Stewart's work, Nick Stewart and Killian's workshops, plus the work that those 2 individuals did. I was talking about charophytes, but that was just part of a larger aquatic project, which lasted for about 3 weeks, I think. And it started off in Cleggan with Killian. The left-hand picture was the safety briefing at the beginning, and everybody's prepared for wet weather, which continued throughout most of the day. Here we are out seeing some of the specialities of West Galway. And the next picture down on the right is on Omey Island, looking at some charophytes with Killian. After Killian's bit, during June 2019, Nick Stewart came and started basically at the northwest corner of Ireland and worked his way to the southeast, visiting hectads and sites on the way. On his first day, he was up in North Donegal And the left-hand picture shows him having refound Potamogeton hybrid Griffithii at its only site in Ireland. Nick had found it there 25 years ago, and we went back to the lake, and there it was in profusion. So that was an exciting start to Nick's stay. He did all sorts of species, but especially pondweeds. The right-hand picture, I think there were either 9 or 10 species of pondweeds laid out along the top of this bridge, and they'd all come from the river just down to the right, which was in County Longford, I think. And Nick is going through the finer points of each of the pondweeds, Potamogeton, nitens, and gramineus, and so on. There were Nick, on his travels, took in charophytes as well as flowering plants. Here we are in the left-hand picture at Rosa Penna, this very shallow lake where there are a lot of charophytes, and another very interesting hybrid between Potamogeton pectinatus and filiformis, I think. The right-hand picture is a pool in the dunes at Sheskin Moor in West Donegal, and all the bits of vegetation sticking out of the water are various sorts of charophytes. There were 6 or 7 or 8 species found in a series of pools at this site. After Donegal, we went to Sligo, and in the left-hand picture you see Nick up to his thighs in the middle of a river with all these long, stringy, strappy leaves heading downstream. Those of us standing on the bridge were fairly sure that we'd say that they were all something like Sparganium immersum. But when Nick came back and showed us what he had found, and we worked through his keys, that you can see what is happening in the right-hand picture. When we worked through the keys, there were, I think, 4 different groups represented in all these long strappy leaves, including things like flowering rush and Untitled. So there's so much to learn when you're with an expert like Nick, and we were privileged to have his company. Being Ireland, there was a huge mixture of sunshine and showers over the several weeks that Nick was here. The left-hand picture, everybody's enjoying the sunshine and has their sun hats on to save themselves from sunburn. But I'm afraid the right-hand picture shows County Fermanagh and Lough Erne, and the rain and drizzle pouring down as we try to find what we can get out of the lake at Carrickray. Nick started work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and there are pictures, I don't have them, of us trying to identify plants by torchlight at 10 and 11 o'clock at night. So there were 12 and 14-hour days worked, but occasionally Nick and his other botanists were allowed to stop for a rest. Here's Nick having a cup of tea on the top of a car. The right-hand picture was an ice cream stop on a very hot day, and it was very welcome. So at the end of the aquatic project, what had been achieved? Well, Sarah put together all the numbers, and this was what she told me recently. There were 6,397 records at 239 sites in 97 hectads and 27 vice counties. That's more than half the vice counties in Ireland were visited as part of this project. So, as well as what we've described up to now, we thought that there were the Committee for Ireland thought there were certain groups that we should upskill ourselves in. And one of these was the Atriplexes. And luckily, Paul Green was brave enough to take on the challenge of teaching the rest of us. And interestingly, as a result of his work and the specimens that people sent him, a new species was found in Ireland, and a hybrid of the new species and Atriplex glabriuscula, Atriplex praecox, and its hybrid with Atriplex glabriuscula were both new to Ireland. Here is Nick running a course up on the County Louth coast where there was an amazing collection of Atriplexes on the shingle. To show again a map of 2014, 15, 16 and 17, 18, 19, the contrast between these two maps. Most of the inland, many of the inland records are Atriplex patula. So the most interesting ones are to look at the coastal areas. And if you look at the coast from, say, Sligo round the north coast till you get to County Down, you will see on the left-hand map there's lots of spaces in the coast where no Atriplexes were recorded. But go to the right-hand map and you will see that starting in Sligo, I think every hectad along the whole coast, and you can keep going till you come to about Bray Head, every hectad along that whole stretch of coast had Atriplexes recorded in it, many of them new hybrids and things. So thank you, Paul, to all your expertise on that. Euphrasias, we ran a workshop, the CFI ran a workshop in the Botanic Gardens, and Chris came and we looked at dry specimens over a few days in the winter. And then later Chris came with the fern group and spent some time in Ireland. Now, again, like the Atriplexes, as a result of Chris's work and interesting people, the 2 new species were added to the Irish list in the last year. Euphrasia Heslop harrisonii, which the left-hand map, it's rather small, but you can see it is red dots along the Orkneys, some of the Outer Hebrides, Inner Hebrides, and there's a new site in East Donegal in that circle there. So that's new to Ireland. And another interesting species, Euphrasia fowlaiensis, which occurs the whole way from Shetland all through the Orkneys, northern Scotland, the Outer Hebrides. And if you follow the dots down, 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 it has now been found out here at Port near Glencolumkill, where Chris found it in 2018. So the Euphrasia workshop led to some interesting finds. Other experts came, not necessarily at the request of the Committee for Ireland, but the British Pteridological Society came in 2018. And I think probably the most interesting things that they added were new records for various members of the Dryopteris affinis group. Them being fern people especially, they were very interested in that group. So there's some interesting new records from that added by them. I don't know how many of you can recognize these people by their bottoms. I won't let on who they are, but this again is out near Port, and everybody is kneeling down photographing the plant on the right, which is yet more Ophioglossum azoricum, of which there's about 100 little spikes on this mound of gravelly earth by a roadside. So to finish this part of the talk, congratulations and well done. I showed you the maps, I've showed you various numbers, but here is a last set of numbers to take in. I asked Tom Humphrey to look into the DDB, to exclude all duplicates, and to tell me how many records there were from each of the there were 4 5-year periods during the Atlas. How many records did we in Ireland submit during each of these 5-year periods? In the first 5 years, 2000, 2004, 380,000. The next 5 years, up to January 2010, 500,000. The next 5 years, up to 2014, another 500,000 and a few bits extra. And in the last 5 years of the Atlas project, we did 1.3 million records. And interestingly, if you add up the first 5 years, the second 5 years, and the third 5 years, they give almost exactly the same figure as we achieved in the last 5 years. Adding up all 4 figures, you get to the total number of records in Ireland post-2020 is 2.8 million. And if you divide that by 100 botanists or something, 100 botanists, that'd be 28,000 records per botanist. Quite interesting. So well done. So can I finish by saying congratulations again to all of you for what we have all put together to and what we have achieved for Atlas 2020. But don't think that that's the end of things. Get out there and grasp, make up some opportunities to keep yourself interested over the next few years. Thank you for listening.